Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be talking a bit about cap modding with this as our test subject, and I've already done all the testing because it took several hours and I don't edit video, so, that's how that works. It's just like, at this point I'm just going to show you test result pictures and talk about the test results. So, yeah, anyway, here is the victim, the test subject, and the test subject is an HD 7970 based on a sort of, it's not really a reference card, it's semi-custom. It's kind of based on the PCB you would get with a reference 7950, except it has the option to go up to 7 phases, but 7 phases cost too much, so Power Color, I think it's a Power Color card, Power Color decided not to do that. Anyway, the reason why I own this card is because it has a red PCB. Like, literally, that's it. Like, I was on eBay, and I was like, it would be cool to have a 7970 with a red PCB. And so I went and got myself a 7970 with a red PCB. Anyway, so that's kind of the story of how I got it. The shroud on the card just kind of sucked, and the heatsink just kind of sucked, so I scrapped that. Kept the heatsink, because it's still a perfectly good heatsink. I have tons of Tahiti cards where I can use it. And then I have, these are probably going to end up coming off because I want to use them on a 7990. But I have, like, for now, these are kind of just floating around in my collection of fans. So I threw them on this temporarily for the duration of testing because, like, honestly, I still think it looks really cool. Unfortunately, this is actually more than 3 slots large now, this card is, because the fans are at an angle each, which kind of, like, thermally that's maybe a little bit of a good thing because basically it forces more of the air. Well, in a case it sucks. On an open air test bench it's perfectly fine because it pushes the air more away from the center of the card. So yeah, anyway, it's not like I'm going to be testing air direction on this thing anyway. So still, temperatures were fine, except I was really just running like Fire Strike, and the card, since it is based on the HD 7950 PCB loosely, it is one of those cards that has an OCP because this card doesn't ship without any real VRM cooling. So normally you just get it and you just basically get this heatsink and a shroud and that was it. Like, it's one of those super down-costed 7970s. Now, there are 7970s with even further down-costed PCBs. You can go as low as getting a 7970 with a 4-phase VRM and completely disabled voltage control, because you know what would happen if that wasn't disabled. Yeah, so with this thing, I've been messing around with it and testing basically cap modding, and here is the back of the card. This is where all of the action happens. So yeah, I now kind of regret, like, I'm starting to have second thoughts about this, not because it doesn't work, but because my intention was like, ooh, it's a red PCB 7970, I'll have it as like a little collector's card, and then I did that. And it's not a problem of, like, this is a problem for the lifespan of the card, it's a problem because that looks like a mess. If I wanted to, I could have made that a lot neater. It would have probably taken me twice as much time to do. Like, these four right here, these are relatively well aligned, but this mess right here, well, that's just a mess. Like, they're not even, like, I want them in a straight line. I think it could have looked a lot neater. Some of them are not attached in what I would consider, like, all of them are currently a massive structural integrity hazard because they're attached to, like, if we zoom in on that, they're just soldered onto multi-layer ceramics. And the thing about, soldering really anything like this to a multi-layer ceramic capacitor is multi-layer ceramic capacitors are not structurally robust. So if you, like, let's say you just, like, hit something, like hit these caps with something from the side, it will probably shear off bits and pieces of that multi-layer ceramic, which sucks. So that's kind of the main issue with doing this, is just, yeah, you do put a lot of stress. Well, it's just a structural integrity hazard. Anyway, we do have these supports on the back of the card so that, it doesn't actually, because these are ultimately like the tallest points of the entire card at this point. So if you lay it down on its back, it would normally rest on the capacitors, which is, again, not good for the capacitors. So that's why I have the screws going through here, just to support the card when it's face up. Yeah, so I have little probe points right down the center here for, did I actually, no, you should have seen the screws, right? Yeah. there. So those and this one. Anyway, I keep forgetting that, it's like I have to actually manage the camera myself because there's no camera person. Anyway, um, this right here is what I use for hooking up the oscilloscope probe. It's literally one of, I had it on the desk and now it's gone. Oh, here it is. Oops. So I have a bunch of these like random sockets and I just got the idea like, wait, this looks kind of like it could hold an oscilloscope probe pretty well. Like it could fit an oscilloscope probe rather well. And so here's a scope probe, right? And damn it, it's not working. This is what I get for trying to do anything on it. There. Right, like that. It's not super well attached, but it's not really going anywhere. And the nice thing is that this gives me a really short attachment length, because the thing is, if you try to like use alligator clips or anything like that, it just picks up random crap from the environment. So much of it. Like honestly, even this is just, if you just have that extension on the probe, like if you just have the, like if I just have this sitting like that, it already starts picking up like random environmental noise than if you don't have anything on the end of the probe. So any extra length is just no. Um, but yeah, so I shortened it. So basically I cut one of these up, which actually this is the cut up one, right? That's what's left of it. So I can actually keep making these attachments for like motherboards, GPUs, whatever, because this is so much more convenient than what I was messing around with on the Maximus 11 Gene, where basically I had like an arm thing holding the probe right up against the capacitors, and it had a tendency that like if you shook the table a little bit, it would just slip out, and you'd have to readjust the whole thing back into position. So I'm really happy that this works as well as it does, because you basically just like in the test bench I was running with, I literally just plugged it in and it would just sort of sit there for a lot longer than what I when I was doing the Maximus 11 Gene. So anyways, this probing technique works really, really well, because it holds the probe. It's not, it doesn't add a whole bunch of extra wire length, so it doesn't pick up a whole bunch of random noise, and it works really, really well. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And yeah, and then basically I attached that, and I took a measurement at stock, and then I took a measurement at, well, a few different iterations of all of the capacitors that we see here. And I recorded the results. I also recorded how the card overclocks. I was only testing with like one round of GT1 of Firestrike, so I wasn't running a full benchmark, because the issue is that, especially with GPUs, well, actually anything really, it's just like, it's really hard. Like ideally, I'd have like a temperature controlled water cooling loop, where the water cooling loop is constantly being held at, I don't know, 20 degrees Celsius by like a compressor or something. So that when I load up the card, the water temperature doesn't start going up. Because if the card, like if you start doing testing at 20 degrees and you finish doing testing at 30 degrees water temperature, your results at 30 degrees water temperature are wrong. Like it's that simple. They're just wrong. So yeah, basically I was just doing GT1 because that doesn't give me too much, like there's not too much variability in how much it'll heat up, right? The heatsink, like I recorded the maximum temperature, which throughout testing was constant, so that's good. That was one thing I was really worried about, was just like making sure that my max temperature after each run was the same. Because if it was any higher, then it's just like that run's invalid. Like if the temperature was any higher and the run crashed at a lower frequency, well, the whole test is invalid. It's just like, yeah, it crashed because it potentially crashed because your temperature's gone up, not necessarily because of whatever I did. So anyway, yeah, put kind of, so the testing wasn't super rigorous because it's not like a full run of Firestrike or anything like that, but it's still a pretty good indicator of basic GP core stability and if there was any benefits. Plus, I have a bunch of oscilloscope measurements, so I can obviously just look at what these capacitors are doing to the voltage behind the GPU core. And if I see that there's a major increase in, or major improvement in peak-to-peak voltages and that kind of thing, then, and I also see that, hey, the stability seems to be a bit better, then it's just like, yes, the stability is a bit better, right? So anyway, and I guess let's talk a little bit about the capacitors I used. So these right here are Nichicon FP series RR5s. They're 1500 microfarads each. These are super low ESR. So they're 5 milliohms ESR each, but they're not super low ESL. That's these guys over here. So these four are 1200 microfarads RS8 series. 7 milliohm ESR, and 2 nanohenries ESL, so equivalent series inductance. The reason why I'm using RS8 series capacitors right behind the core is these are supposed to be better across a higher for higher frequency noise. So these can be somewhat effective into like the megahertz range. And that's important when you're right behind the GPU core because that's high frequency, like that's extra high frequency noise in that area. Also, if we zoom in on it, you'll also notice I have a bunch of little multi-layer, and that's too much zoom. That's enough zoom. Okay, you'll also notice I have a bunch of little multi-layer ceramics scattered throughout there, so I added those as well. Unfortunately, it wasn't like I added them in specific waves. I just kept kind of adding capacitors however I felt like. So not super formal testing, but still good results that I saw. But yeah, RS8 series 1200 microfarads for these four. And then these other ones are actually 560 microfarad RS8 series as well. And why did I use 560s? Because 560s are cheaper and I have more of them. So basically, once I added the first four 1200s, like the first round I did was four 1200 microfarads and 3 of the 1500s, and that actually had some really great impact in terms of, well, overclocking and the measured voltages. And then past that, I actually just kind of started adding multi-layer ceramics, started adding the 560s, and that had some more impact. And then, well, let's just go to the bloody charts. Hey, why don't we just go to the bloody charts? There we go. There's the charts. And I should probably zoom in on the charts. Well, now you can't see them. Genius me. There. That helps. Yeah, okay. So, this is the stock card with absolutely no capacitors, right? And it would crash above 1250 megahertz core. It ran, the whole time I was running 1800 megahertz memory clock, 1237 millivolts just because, like, optimal, like, if you test it at a higher voltage, there's potential for more impact from more capacitors because there's more current, there's bigger transients, that kind of thing. But I was testing at 1237 because this card, being based on the reference HD7950 PCB, has an overcurrent protection that kicks in once you start approaching the 1.3 volts mark. And I didn't want to deal, like, I have a BIOS for removing that. I just don't know where I put it. I don't really feel like looking for it. So I was testing at 1237. So yeah, 1237 millivolts. Card would go up to 1250 core for GT1, which is, like, that's impressive. Like, honestly, that's really quite impressive, especially considering that it's hitting, like, 58C core. If it was cooler, it would probably, like, if I could hold it colder, lower temperature, then I could probably finish the whole Fire Strike run at 1250 with that kind of voltage. But anyway, here's the oscilloscope measurements. So VRMS 1.2 volts, Vmin 1.06, Vmax 1.34, so that's our overshoot. Peak to peak was 280 millivolts. Now, I actually have scope shots of that. So this is one of the stock. So this is just some part of Fire Strike running. As you can clearly see, it's a disgusting mess, but that's just normal. GPUs. GPUs are far worse in terms of transients compared to CPUs. Like, the CPUs don't hold, like, the CPUs next to GPUs are absolute jokes. But anyway, so here we have the lovely mess that is Fire Strike running. And here's some zoomed in portions, and you can clearly see we have some pretty, like, that's some pretty severe undershoot right there. Like, it just falls off a cliff before the voltage regulator starts to recover. This is where it's supposed to be based on the load line, but this is where it drops because of the stock capacitor configuration. On, you know, load release right here, some pretty major overshoot, then it settles back down. Like, we're at 80 millivolts per division. So, yeah, like, from here to here is 160 millivolts. So that right there is just like, yeah, that's like 50 millivolts over where it eventually settles on, right? And again, we just have a mess just throughout everywhere. Then we have this right here, which this is actually, I wonder if there's a better, oh, idiot me didn't take a nice sample of the, like, partial zoom. Yeah, idiot me. But for some of the other measurements, but there's basically a part of the frame render cycle, which is just a disgusting mess that looks like this. And this disgusting mess is also very high peak to peak. So we can probably clean this up with some more capacitors as well. It is worth noting that this is a pretty old 7970. Like, this is a pre-boost edition 7970. So there's a good chance that the capacitors that this came with are pretty degraded at this point. Like, I don't know what kind of life this card had. It might not have, it might have been a mining card. It might have been a mining card that was used to mine Bitcoin. And Bitcoin mining was especially abusive to the GPU core itself, and therefore the power delivery for the GPU core. So if this was a Bitcoin mining card because of how old it is, right? Because nobody mines Bitcoin, like for when Bitcoin was first big, it was originally mined with GPUs, and then it started getting mined with ASICs. And so if this was like an ex Bitcoin mining card, then yeah, like the capacitors on this thing may very well be shot. But anyway, so here we have just some nice, well, some absolute failures of regulation as well. More of the same, right? Massive undershoot right there, more undershoot over here, more overshoot, more overshoot. This mess, which just, yeah, card doesn't have a hope of ever regulating that. More undershoot. All right, just basically zoomed in on bits and pieces of this right here. And it just looks like a horrendous mess. Like, even here, we just have 280 millivolts peak to peak at already just 200 microseconds. So, yeah, like, that's 1.34 right there, and that's 1.06. So, evidently, a mess. Very much a mess. So, if we go back to my actual cap mods, so that would be round 1 that we'll look at next. So I first added 3 of the RR5 caps and 4 of the 1200 microfarad RS8 caps. And that led to a 20 megahertz increase in max core clock for GT1. It led to a 50 millivolt decrease in peak to peak. And that is being measured right behind the core. And keep in mind that I put 4 of those 1200 microfarad caps right next to the core. Or like, basically I decided, because the logic behind putting them right next to the core for me is like, that's where we need the voltage, right? Like, sure, these capacitors might not be in the frequency range of most of the noise the GPU core is producing, but when the core wants power, it's better if it can grab it from a couple millimeters away rather than a couple, like, if we switch over to the view of the card, right, and zoom out a bit, and then shift, no, like, so normally all of your bulk capacitance is over here. If the card suddenly needs power, like a lot of current, it would have to pull it from all the way over here. Well, it would be better if it could just pull it right where it is. So that's why I put all of these right behind the GPU core. Now, practically speaking, you can't do this in a retail card because there's no space to put the caps normally, right? That's why you only get the little multi-layer ceramics. And on a lot of cards, you'll sometimes see like large SMD capacitors right behind the core, but practically speaking, you can't do something like this on a retail card. So anyway, but I crammed the 1200 microfarads on. Also, I crammed them on this side of the core because this side of the core tends to have lower voltage, which basically my logic behind that is, well, if on load release, the caps are charged to, like, if we look at all of the capacitors on the VRM, the highest voltage caps charged to the highest voltage will be over here. And caps charged to the lowest voltage will be just basically on this side of the GPU core. So if I have a bunch of capacitors sitting at a lower voltage than everywhere else, then when on load release we have a bunch of extra energy getting dumped from the inductors, well, these will take more energy to charge up before we start getting like high voltages. So, because they'll be lower below the VRM voltage anyway. So that's kind of the logic of why I wanted to put them there. And eventually you just run out of space, right? So that's why I ended up with this. And ultimately, like, I added 3 more of these in one round of the additions, which you saw in the chart. And it didn't really make the overshoot any worse. So I don't know. Like, I am thinking of doing an experiment where I actually remove all of these and see what that does to our peak voltage. And if it doesn't go, like, if it leads to the peak voltage being lower, then add caps behind the core, don't add caps near the VRM. If it leads to no improvement, then don't add caps to the VRM anyway, because you're just wasting time, right? If it doesn't make a difference, if the existence of these doesn't make a difference, don't bother with them. If the existence of these leads to an improvement, then yes, do bother with them. So there's like sort of 3 potential outcomes for that test. But I didn't do that test yet because, yeah, you know, that at this point, like, I've spent several hours on it already, and it's just like, I don't know, I might anecdotally, like, if you see this card again and it's missing all of these capacitors, it's because I decided that they don't actually help, or that they don't help enough or something like that. So anyway, so yeah, basically just cramming your capacitors right behind the core is theoretically should be better. So Anyway, for some stuff, because there's also like like there's switching noise from the voltage regulator itself, and you actually want to have capacitors to clean that up right off the voltage regulator. You don't necessarily want that traveling all the way down the power plane. So yeah, it's not like you can't like it's not like you would want to have no capacitors right by the VRM, though there are some cards that almost like basically do that, like AVGA on the classifieds. They'll often have the three-phase memory power, which is like a mile away from the actual memory chips themselves. They'll often put the entire output filter on the memory chips and not anywhere near the memory VRM proper. So I don't know, maybe, you know, I might be right about it. It might just be best to put all of your capacitance by the actual load and screw the VRM. Still need to do more testing on that, because so far I've like most of my testing with cap modding so far has been just trying to see like what kind of impact it has with an oscilloscope, and how, is it even worth doing? And well, I'd argue it's still not worth doing, because this is like, I'm pretty sure the total cost of all of these capacitors is approaching like £10, and this card is worth 40. So I've added like 25% of the card's stock cost to it in just capacitors. Good job, me. Though admittedly, I'm not paying bulk prices because I'm not buying them in a reel, right? Like if you were buying a reel, the caps would actually be probably like half of what I pay. But anyway, so back to result charts. So yeah, first round of additions, 3 times 1500 RR5s, 4 times 1200 RS8s. The RS8s are right behind, just whacked right up against the core. And the end result was a drop in Vmax, so down to 1.32 volts, a Vmin increase of 1.08 volts. So we're getting less undershoot, we're getting less overshoot. We can clearly see that right there. Our average voltage hasn't changed, which I didn't expect it to. And peak to peak voltage is now 230 millivolts. So yeah, potentially we have better, you know, more lifespan out of the GPU core because there's less overshoot. So voltage driven degradation effects are less, there's less of them basically because there's less voltage. And our overclocking is better because we have less undershoot. We have more, we've basically picked up 20 millivolts worth of V-core without actually having to raise the V-core. And you can kind of see that in the whole, hey, we picked up almost 20 megahertz worth of core speed. So that's like, honestly, it's kind of insane that this card can do such high clocks at such low voltage. And it gets better once I really, you know, press on the capacitor mods. Yeah, so decent improvements right off the bat. And the end result is that the graphs on the oscilloscope look like this. All right, so you can see peak to peak, like literally, I think that's 240 millivolts. Idiot me. The thing is, it's actually like I don't have a capture of all, because sometimes I'd have a peak of 1.32 and sometimes I have a peak of 1.31, right? Like here I captured a moment when we have 1.31 peak, minimum 1.08. But anyway, the notes are considering the full passive GT1, so not just, you know, one single capture. Anyway, yeah, if we look at that, we can still see it's a mess, but it's a smaller mess, right? Peak to peak is now 30 millivolt, 230 instead of 280 millivolts, so that's progress. And then we have some zoom ins, and yeah, that's the mess basically that I was talking about. And then here we can see some of the pretty obvious transient spikes in between. If we zoom in on some of those, there's still a good amount of undershoot and overshoot, but it's a bit more controlled, a bit, right? So yeah, then I found this mess, which I'm not sure if that, like, this could just be the GPU, because I'm not seeing any obvious like load release spike, but maybe that ramp down there, I'm not sure. Like these seem to be going too quickly for it to be really clear what's going on there. Then here we have some, yeah, like that's some spectacular overshoot right there. And then that looks a bit like a load release, and then immediately just slams back into load. So yeah, GPUs are just very, very noisy loads because of the type of workload they do. So yeah, basically a mess. And then here we have the actual mess, and we can see a like pretty clear overshoot right there. That looks like a load release. Oh, well, no, that's undershoot right there. That's overshoot. And then here we have the mess, right, which is that part right there. So that's the zoom in of that mess, and it's literally just a mess. Like that's the only way I can describe that. So let's move on. So after that, I decided, you know what we need? We need we need more capacitors. We need more high frequency filtering. So 560 microfarad RS8s. So if we go back to the capture card, that's these four right here in the nice neat line. That's those. And then I picked up the 347 microfarad multilayer ceramics and 522 microfarad multilayer ceramics. These are 0805 package, and these are 0603 package. So these are these are a smaller package size, which in theory should mean they have a lower ESL, lower ESR, and should work again at a higher frequency range than the 0805s. And the 0805s should work at higher frequency ranges than any kind of, through-hole capacitor that you can get your hands on. Now, admittedly, they do make some very low ESL, very low ESR, SMD aluminum polymers and aluminum tantalum, and tantalum polymers, but those are insanely expensive. Like, I really want to, like, Panasonic has a capacitor series called, I think it's the TPSF, and they make a 220 microfarad capacitor. It's tiny. I think it's this package right here. Like, it's in this package size, and it's like 6 milliohm ESR, and it's 0.7 nanohenry ESL. These are 2 nanohenry ESL. The thing is, that really nice TPSF capacitor that I've dug up on DigiKey is about $2 a piece. So it's just like, you put five of the, like, if I put five of them on this card, it would basically it's insane. Like, the only cards that it would make sense to use that kind of cap on is like 1080 Ti's, 2080 Ti. Well, really rare or really high-end cards that, have a lot of value to me, and this is basically a random 7970. And also at the same time, it's just like, I don't want to buy them because they're like, it's 20, like, you can buy 10 for $20, and it's just like, well, that's insane. And I obviously want more of them than that, and I'm just like, well, if I, like, yeah, so I'd like to pick some of those up, but they're so freaking expensive. Anyway, so back to testing. So added a whole bunch of, like, higher frequency filtering stuff. Knocked down the peak to 190. Vmax is now 1.3. Vmin is now 1.1. And, yeah, VRMS for some reason came up a little bit to 1.21, but still, core temperature is maxing out at 58C. And so that's final round. And unfortunately, some idiot took the pictures in the wrong order. So I think this one's the one I wanted to show. Yeah, so this is the first round of clean the mess up. And you can see, yeah, so min is still 1.1 here, and max is 1.29. So that's the only shot I have of that configuration. And then there's the sort of current configuration of the card where I went just like, I just added as many capacitors as I could fit at that point. And we're on 1500 6 RR5s at that point, still the 41200s, 6 56s. So basically added this one and that one. Because basically I decided, like, I'm going to do 1280 core on 1237 millivolts no matter what. And here it was like barely crashing towards the end of the test. So I was like, there's got to be a way to get it to finish the bloody test at 1280. So yeah, I pulled out all the stops basically and added even more of the 22 microfarad caps. Just two more though. Not that many more. But that managed to knock down the peak voltage to 1.28 and min voltage. So yeah, like, I really worked the peak way down. The minimum voltage didn't really improve. And the reason I think for that is that at some point, basically, because there's obviously the load line of the voltage regulator, and at some point, if I am trying to force the there's going to be a intentional minimum voltage, right? Like, if the load line on this GPU was say 0.7 ohms, right? Which would be pretty, like, that's pretty low. Intel spec for a lot of CPUs is like 1 milliohm. Not 0.7, 0.7 milliohms. But Intel spec for a lot of CPUs is like 1 milliohm, 2 milliohms, or something like that. So I think it's 0.7 milliohms on this card, because during testing, I also checked the vCore current draw, and it's around like almost 200 amps. So somewhere around 1 milliohm worth of load line intentionally from the card. So the minimum voltage, right, if we set the VRM to output a voltage of 1.237 volts, then our minimum voltage at 200 amps output current, assuming a 1 milliohm load line, should actually be like no, should be 0.5 milliohm. Yeah, that makes more. Yeah, okay, I had a mistake in the math. If it was 0.5 milliohm, then it should be drooping all the way down intentionally to 1.137, right? Because 200 amps times 0.5 milliohms is 100 millivolts. So here, if the load line is, say, 0.6 or 0.7 milliohms, then yeah, 1.1 volts might actually be intentional from the voltage regulator, and we're not going to, I can't get that minimum voltage any higher. So anyway, but we can obviously get the Vmax down because that's still overshoot. So we're still overshooting because at some point these two, they're just not going to improve at some point. But anything higher than the set voltage is actually technically overshoot. So yeah, anyway, and that's idiot. And that's this graph right here, right? So that's the 170 millivolts peak to peak. So I knocked it way down from the original 280, shaved off what, 110 millivolts peak to peak shaved off with just adding capacitors. Picked up a good 30 megahertz core clock in the process, which is that's good to see. Anyway, the improvement in stability here was really marginal. So I think the minimum voltage measurement might not be showing the advantages that the card is getting. But anyway, so here's a sample of that actually running, and then I zoomed in on bits and pieces of it, and you can see just like that overshoot, that undershoot right there is just really a lot smaller than what I used to be getting. This right here is just that's flat. That's a perfect transition right there. There's no difference. It's also not a very big transition, right? This voltage right here and to the after voltage that's not a very big step down. Then we have this right here, which, on some of the previous shots, I'm pretty sure I included a sample of this, and well, this is really well controlled, right? This looks almost smooth. This right here, I'm not sure. That could be a measurement anomaly. That could also just that could actually be noise. So maybe I need even more high frequency, more multi-layer ceramics at this point. Because some stuff I think bulk capacitance, I think there's enough of at that point. Then here we have something this is perfect as far as I'm concerned. This is straight up perfect. That's a straight line almost. This right here is also really just rather well controlled. Right, also almost a straight line. The mess from previous shots is now, it's still a mess. It's just much lower amplitude. And this right here is much smoother as well overall. So yeah, basically, and then here's a bit of a, yeah, there's a partial zoom in. So this is 5 milliseconds time scale, and then this is 2 milliseconds, and yeah, it's just, and you can see the mess right there, but this thing is just much cleaner than what I had before, right? Compared to what I started with, this is, I'm kind of trying to think of how I could comparison them. I should have prepared an overlay photo of the two, but whatever. The measurements don't lie, massive freaking improvement. And, yeah, so cap modding, it does work. It does seem like, I still need to do the test where I actually take off all the big bulk ones by the VRM. And if that doesn't lead to a major increase in peak to peak voltage, then the conclusion is that if you're doing cap mods, you should just pile them onto the GPU core and ignore the rest of the card, because the core, it's about the core. It's not about the VRM. The VRM doesn't care how much ripple is on the other side of it. It's the core that complains when your voltage drops too low for some reason. Or if your voltage overshoots so hard that it actually the thing is, the overshoot concern is really you'd need a lot of overshoot to really cause an issue. Because basically the exposure is so short that I would assume that you'd have to basically hit gate breakdown voltage levels, and those are going to be really, really high. But admittedly, if you're, I guess if you're pushing super borderline voltages where you're minutes away from killing your degradation. Like if you're at voltage levels where degradation is measured in like minutes or hours, and you have major overshoot, yes, I could see that instantly killing the CPU or CPU or GPU at random. That would actually make sense. But if you're at like normal voltage levels, then the overshoot shouldn't be able to get anywhere near insta death, right? And it shouldn't be, since it's like short spikes, it shouldn't be long enough to really cause any long-term, like significant long-term damage. So yeah, but definitely this should improve tolerance for extreme voltage on on Sub-Zero. At the same time, there's also the whole issue when you're Sub-Zero that you have temperature effects to consider. And so just because your silicon won't suddenly die at high voltage doesn't necessarily mean it'll overclock better at high voltage, right? That's the two different things. Just because you can run a lot of voltage doesn't mean it'll clock better. Yeah, the improvement in minimum voltage is definitely like that's, I think, basically where we're seeing all of that gain in core clock is just from the minimum voltage improvement. And I think we're not seeing yeah, I'm not sure that we're seeing the full picture between these two because, maybe there's like 5 millivolts difference there. Because this was almost doing, like, this run was already almost doing 1280. And then this one this one's sketchy. It can do 1280 and it does perform better. Like, that's another concern. I had a few runs where it was technically passing 1280, but the performance was god awful. So I was just like, well, that doesn't count. But this can actually, like, it will outperform 1270. It will finish GT1, which was the only criteria I had, is just like, this core clock has to finish GT1 because I'm not patient enough to do a full Fire Strike run. And yeah, it was finishing it and it was scoring better. So at that point, it's just like cap mod success, right? Fun fact with R9 290Xs, if you're cap modding 290Xs, what tends to, at least one of my 290Xs, instead of crashing outright, it'll just spit out worse scores. So on that one, when you cap mod, if you see a performance improvement, that actually means the mod is working, right? Which is kind of funny because it doesn't make a difference to your crashing capabilities. It just makes your scores higher, which is honestly kind of annoying because sometimes you could sometimes it could just be run to run variants of the benchmark. And but admittedly, if there's like a full restart in between and you take multiple samples, but still, it's just annoying. Anecdotes from previous testing sessions of similar things, but yeah, so cap modding. And the funny thing is I actually have capacitors that are even better than what I used on this card, but they're expensive. they're in that $2 Panasonic, SMD type aluminum polymers, 3 milliohm ESR, and they're awesome. They're absolutely amazing, and I'm saving them for either the Titan Z or the Radeon Pro Duo, the Fiji Radeon Pro Duo. Like, one of those two is going to get those. But yeah, I'm just super happy that like the probing technique I came up with is working really well, right? We're obviously seeing very clearly, like, we can see transients, which is great. In the past, when I tried to do this kind of thing, a long time ago when I first was messing around with taking scope shots of stuff running, it was just like I couldn't get this kind of stuff. Like I was picking up so much random noise because the probes were too, like, the probe leads were too long, that you couldn't see anything like this. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the results. So this is where it started, 280, just big, fat, disgusting mess. And then this is where it ended up. Still a mess, but significantly less fat. So yeah. And I do still wonder, is like, hey, what if I used some even more expensive capacitors? Could I, like, I don't know, get 1.12 or 1.13 millivolts? But the thing is that at this point, I'm starting to think I might just be hitting the limits of the load line calibration, because at some point that's just going to be what's going to limit you. So I really want to mess with this on a motherboard, which is like low end and has LLC settings, because then, right, once you would start with a relatively normal LLC setting, and if you see a lot of and you have a really big disgusting mess, so you start adding capacitors until it cleans up, then you adjust the LLC upwards and you start adding capacitors again until it cleans up. Because in theory, and I want to see how far I could push it doing that kind of test procedure. I might even try do that on the Maximus 11G. I'm just not sure. Like, I think that motherboard shouldn't benefit from extra capacitors. That doesn't, like, that board's meant for extreme overclocking. So it feels kind of like, like that's kind of the thing is just, well, I don't know. I really don't know. I think that board already is like 40 millivolts peak to peak though, even under like worst case scenario loading. So I'm not sure. Well, no, because here I'm still like here I'm bumping up against the load line calibration. On the Gene, I guess I can just set the LLC so high that it'll still be like overshooting and undershooting really hard, and then I can start adding the capacitors, and it might help. Um, yeah. Still, oh my god, this video is 40 minutes. I thought it was going to be short. I'm like, I did 4 tests. How much can I say about 4 tests? But apparently a lot. Maybe I'm just repeating myself a lot, though. But yeah, so first round of mods on this card done. And yeah, the one thing I regret from testing is I wasn't very careful taking the heatsink off once, and so the card has a chipped corner. Like the die has a chipped corner on it at this point, so idiot me. Because at this point it's just like this thing runs well, now I need to do full passes of Fire Strike with it. I need to like but still like I'm kind of tempted to replicate this exact test methodology and modding methodology on a bunch of my other cards now. And it's just like, well, it's going to take forever because it's not fast, right? Because it's just like mod the card, put it in the system, hook up the scope, wait. Well, it's not that long either. Unlike real reviewers, I don't need to wait for freaking games to run. But yeah, definitely a fun session to mess around, like fun thing to mess around with. And for competitive, like you might say, oh, but for daily usage, this doesn't, this doesn't have any point. And I'd agree, 20 megahertz for well, I don't know. I don't know. Personally, like the thing is cap mods are really low risk. Like the main issue you can run into with capacitor mods is if you add capacitors to like memory, like basically your main concern is that you might hit the overcurrent protection of the voltage regulator during the soft start procedure, because if you have a whole bunch of capacitance on the output of the regulator, like it needs to charge up when you're starting the voltage regulator, right? When you start, and I'm just realizing the camera is going to run out of battery, but I don't have a soft start O-scope shot, so you're screwed. It'll run out of battery, and that's kind of the end. But basically, I guess I could switch to one of the... No, I'd need to rearrange the microphone. There's no way that's happening anytime soon. Plus, the lighting in the room is completely screwed up, and there's a mess everywhere. So, yeah, you're stuck staring at this until the camera crashes because it's going to run out of battery. But anyway, so the main concern is that, yeah, on some, like, if you have a low phase count, low power voltage regulator, you can potentially run into a situation when the voltage regulator starts up, the current draw that the extra capacitors put on it when it's charging from 0 volts to, well, it's charging the capacitors. When it's charging them from 0 volts to, say, 0.9 volts or whatever your starting voltage is, if that current draw is too high, it will potentially trip over current protection. And then it'll get sort of like, depending on the voltage regulator, that'll either mean the VRM doesn't start up at all, and you'll just be left without memory power or something. Or you can run into a situation where which I actually run into that with a motherboard, where I put 12, like, different, well, we'll get back to it. Or you can run into, so some voltage regulators, they'll just not, like, they'll trip OCP and they won't start, and that's the end of that. Or they'll trip OCP and try to start again, and then they'll trip OCP again and again and again, and you'll just, well, it still won't work. End of the story is it still won't bloody work because you have too much capacitance on there. Now with GPUs, this is relatively safe because you have giant multi-phase voltage regulators which will have OCP settings somewhere in the hundreds of amps range. In most cases, 100 plus amps, depending on what GPU you're looking at. If it's really low end, it might be tens of amps, but still, it should be plenty of current to charge up a couple extra capacitors. And yeah, so on GPUs, this is relatively safe. On vCore, big voltage regulators, it's relatively safe. But if you're doing this to something like a memory rail, which I have seen on some GPUs, especially NVIDIA GPUs, when I added capacitors to like memory power, it would actually help memory overclocking quite significantly. AMD GPUs, I've not really noticed that much. But with NVIDIA ones, I've definitely run into that where it's just like you add a couple capacitors and bam, 100 megahertz more memory clock or whatever. So that actually, I think I had one card which picked up like 300 megahertz, but I think that might have been a testing anomaly. It was also single phase memory power, so that might have had something to do with it. Um, but anyway, yeah, so the caps can help with memory overclocking, but I have run into a situation with, say, my X299 Micro 2 where I was like, I'm making this motherboard do a certain set of memory settings no matter what. So I obviously just was like, I did volt mods, those weren't enough. So eventually I went I added a bunch of capacitors and I added two of the 1200 microfarad RS8 series caps to the memory rails. And this was fine up until you tried to boot the motherboard with until you tried to set like 2 volts dim voltage. Because if you set 2 volts dim voltage on that board, with that much capacitance on the output of the memory VRM, it would trip the overcurrent protection, and it would basically, like, sometimes it would just shut down the memory VRM before the board would get into the post process. So that really sucked. Yeah, that's kind of the main issue you can run into. But other than that, cap mods are like that. There's like the main concerns are don't make a short circuit, but that's a concern with any type of modding, right? Like don't short something. And then the structural integrity is also an issue, right? If you're attaching to multi-layer ceramics, then yes, you do make it very easy to rip them off by extending these massive levers to them. But other than that, there's really not any like concerns with it as far as I'm concerned. Like this is probably the safest thing you can do, unlike any kind of other modification that I've done. This is the ones where it's like I haven't broken anything with added caps except like the OCP thing, which isn't really broken. That's just a safety feature being triggered. Like when I say broken, I mean like dead because of too much voltage, dead because of generally too much voltage. That's the one that kills things. So yeah, that's kind of that. I figured I'd talk about this, and yeah. So I guess thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. What else is there? If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, like buying extremely overpriced, arguably overpriced capacitors. I'd say arguably, because it might turn out that those $2 little freaking tantalums are the best thing ever. And they, like, the thing I'm wondering is, like, because if you have a really good capacitor, it could potentially have the same impact as, like, 4 of these combined. Right? Like, if you could replace 4 larger caps with 1 smaller one, depending on what it is that you're actually dealing with. In some situations, you just need more capacitance, but sometimes it's just like whatever capacitance you do have doesn't have a low enough ESR or a low enough ESL to work. So yeah, it's like potentially some really expensive, polymer, like tantalum polymers or aluminum polymers could work really, really well. But yeah, if you'd like to support things like the purchase of extremely overpriced capacitors, then I have a Patreon. There's also Teespring. You can buy Teesprings for merch. You can buy shirts, posters, hoodies, stickers, that kind of thing. You can find a link to it down in the description below. And of course, there's the Patreon. If you don't want to buy anything, you can just support me directly through that. And that does give you early access to some videos and also access to bonus videos. There's not that many of them, and I think they all suck. But yeah. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye, because the camera's going to run out of battery any minute now.